Hi, everybody. Jeff Toister here. And today I'm joined with a very special guest. If you've ever heard of statistics in customer service that a happy customer will tell maybe 5 people and an unhappy customer will tell 10 people, or perhaps you've heard a statistic that it costs 5 times as much to sell to a new customer as an existing customer. Those are statistics we've probably heard over and over again. And if you've ever wondered, where do they come from? Well, my guest today is responsible for a lot of those statistics. So I'm really excited to have John Goodman with us. And John is the author of Strategic Customer Service. He's just come out with the second edition. We're going to talk a little bit about the book today, as well as a specific tip that you can implement immediately. So John, welcome. It's good to have you.
Great, Jeff. Thanks very much for having me.
So before we get to your book, I wonder, the folklore, if you will, that I shared about those statistics, they come from somewhere. Would you mind sharing just a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thanks very much. Basically, we started out as an ad hoc student group in the basement of Harvard Law School over 40 years ago and have yet to get real jobs. And under one of the original studies that we did for the White House Office of Consumer Affairs, we did an analysis of how much companies were spending to acquire new customers versus what the average cost of resolving a problem to retain the customer was, and that's where the 5-to-1 ratio. Depending on industries now, it's 3-to-1 up to 20-to-1. Also, back in the 80s, we did a study for Coca-Cola where we asked people how many were you satisfied or not, and then how many people did you tell, and that's where the 5 and 10 came from. And during one of those similar studies, we found for General Motors for large ticket items it was 8 and 16. Now, research subsequently has shown that it's probably 3-to-1 as opposed to a 2-to-1 ratio, and you actually can see the updates of our research. We do it, replicate it probably every 3 years. We call it the National Rage Study, which is what makes people so angry they start swearing at a company. And the last one we did was in 2017, and anybody can Google that and find all the most up-to-date data.
So I think that's a good jumping off point to your new book, because I don't know, do you call it a new book or an old book because it's a second edition? Is it the new book or is it the old book? How do you refer to it?
It's really a new book because
Okay.
when the original book was written in 2009, Instagram and Snapchat didn't really exist. And so the technology has changed rather dramatically. And so I would say 60% of the book is new. A number of the basic frameworks are the same, but even those have been enhanced a bit.
Gotcha. And I want to ask you about that, but I have to tell you that when I wrote my first book, it was published in 2012, but I was doing most of the writing in 2011. And my editor, for those of you watching the video, John and I shared an editor for at least one book. But my editor said, you need to stop quoting John Goodman. Enough already. Come up with some different sources. Because I was reading your book. I was reading the original Strategic Customer Service. And it was just had so much useful information. And I really appreciate it. And so it was a joy for me to get to read the second edition. Would you mind giving the viewers just an overview of the book and telling us, what's new in that second edition?
Well, basically, I build on the first one and talk about what's the same versus what has changed since 2009. And the objective is really to help service executives become strategic, which means moving away from being the complaint department and a cost center toward really being the focal point for customer engagement, voice of the customer, and what I call word of mouth management. Basically, it's a stepping stone on the way to becoming the vice president of customer experience. And the real difference between service and customer experience is that customer experience is looking at end to end, and we make a key point that customer onboarding, after the customer has signed and is now being brought on board, is a gap in most companies. Sales and marketing sell the customer, then as soon as they get the signature, they run away. And then service is left to clean up the mess. But really, when I ask in most companies who's in charge of customer onboarding, everybody points the finger somewhere else. So we basically argue that strategic customer service requires the service function to take over that customer onboarding and customer education, because it's much easier to be proactive and preventive than they have to clean up the mess after the fact. And so what the book is really addressing is how to be proactive and preventive through customer onboarding, then have an effective service system that doesn't just solve the problem, but also upsells and educates the customer so they don't get into the next difficulty. Then we have a section on how to use technology the best way to, because most of the customers now, they don't call until they've been to your website and can't find the answer. So our contention is that the service director needs to have ownership over a lot of the content on the website, and we can come back to that in more detail. And then the next to the last part is building the business case, getting the finance people to really understand what the payoff is of great service, and also what is the market damage of inaction. If you leave yourself at just good rather than excellent, you're leaving a huge amount of money on the table, which, and we find appealing to greed really works well. And then the last part is to really empower the front line. And we find most organizations are still in a sheriff mentality where you're keeping the reps from not coloring outside the lines, when in fact that leads in today's labor market with people saying, I'm not getting paid enough to take all this crap, and they leave, as opposed to if you empower them, they're happy to stay and they'll be much more productive.
I want to touch on one thing that you talked about, because there's so much that you've packed into that book. But one thing that I think is for, at least for me, a real strength of the book compared to maybe some other customer service books out there is you really talk about how do we make, the business case. How do we talk to our CFO or our CEO? And you mentioned, for example, market damage, and you have some really nice tools in the book to calculate the impact or potential impact of poor customer service. And I have to tell you, I had a conversation today that's like many conversations. Customer service leaders will say, I know it's bad, I don't know how to quantify it. And I'm wondering, from your experience, why do so many service leaders shy away from or are uncomfortable with the business metrics?
Well, I think a part of it is, and this is actually one of the big recommendations of the book, is that they really haven't created a close alliance with three groups: with customer insights, with continuous improvement, and with IT. And if you are joined at the hip with customer insights, they provide the measurement and the analytical capability. Continuous improvement also provides the ability to pilot test things. Plus, they're very comfortable using dirty data, and they are well plugged into an awful lot of the operational functions where there are both cost savings, but also the opportunity to really make improvements to the process. And then IT is really in an interesting situation at the moment. The Harvard Business Review recently had an article that said CIOs are an endangered species. The reason is that all the data centers are being outsourced to Amazon, and marketing has taken over all the CRM stuff. So there's nothing for the CIO to do. So we've actually worked with a number of CIOs who've said, I am going to take leadership in customer experience, because IT can either be the problem or the solution to a whole bunch of the difficulties that customers now encounter, because, as I said, the customer always goes to the website before they call and say, how the heck do I solve this?
And I think that's one of the things you're talking about, going to the website, and I know you've got a really good example about that. And so one of the things I'm hoping you can share is something that people can implement immediately. To me, that, again, that's a strength of your book. You talk about the high level, but you also have a lot of really practical suggestions. And before we started the interview, you're kind of sharing a really good one with me. I wonder if you could share that example. What's something people could implement right now?
Well, one of the things is to go to your frontline staff, preferably the 2 or 3 bomb throwers in the group, and basically say, what is one preventable type of call that we get a lot? And they will have a list of 5 immediately. And my favorite example, I just presented with the VP of Customer Insights at Aflac in Phoenix, and she was talking about the fact that they were told by their front line, gee, we get an awful lot of calls on how do I print my invoice? And so they had a meeting with continuous improvement and with IT, and the IT guy said, oh, you can print your invoice. You just go 4 clicks into the contact us page or the end of the billing thing, and then the link is right there. Stop. Let's move it from 4 clicks in to the front of the website. And what they found was in 1 month, the number of clicks went from 30,000 to 100,000. Now, what were those 70,000 people doing in the past? They were either being grumpy or they were calling someone and say, how do I print my invoice? And you had a whole bunch of phone calls that were completely a waste of time had that link been highly visible to customers right up front.
Wow. And it's amazing that it's such a simple solution in hindsight, yet I know that your experience is not uncommon, where as leaders, we kind of gather in the conference room and we kind of brainstorm things, but just go ask the front lines and they'll tell you exactly what's going on.
Well, and in fact, what their vice president of service said to her credit in her mandate to this service improvement task force was, don't build what I'm asking you to build. Build what the customer is saying they need. And that really let the IT and the improvement people and the insights people and the service people go do what was relevant. Because your best, as you sort of implied, your best consultants are your frontline staff because they're the ones that are cleaning up the mess on an ongoing basis. I
Uh,
would I would add that these kind of, I would call them dumb questions and trivia that are burning 30% of all service resources just aren't associated with consumer customers. We find that businesses behave the same way as consumers, and in fact, their complaint rates are lower because we find a bad assumption is that almost every uh, business executive says, well, if a customer is paying me $100,000 a month, certainly they're going to tell me whenever they're unhappy. What we find is that is absolutely not the case because I am reticent to complain because I don't want to sour the relationship, or my sales rep is somewhat of a dim bulb, but I don't want to get him in trouble because I'm dependent upon him. And so we actually have found across small, medium, and large businesses that complaint rates for B2B are actually lower than for B2C.
wow. That's interesting stuff, and such a, I think, a good place to leave this, because you have so much great information in the book. And I know that's one of the things that you added to the new edition is more B2B, that of more of the new technology. If people want to find the book, where can they find it?
It's on Amazon is probably the easiest. It's sold by HarperCollins, but Amazon is absolutely the easiest. There's a link there. Just search strategic customer service.
Well, I read the first edition and I read the second edition, and I've enjoyed both. They're such a handy guide. John, thanks for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Okay, my pleasure.